Hello and welcome to the Cinematologists. I'm Neil Fox down here in the Falmouth branch, and with me, as ever, is Dario Linares up in the Hastings branch. Hi, Dario.
Hey, how's it going, Neil? How are you doing? It's nice to speak to you again. It's been a little bit of a little while, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. It feels like ages. Itching to get back into Cinematologist action.
Absolutely. And yeah, we've got a great program of films lined up. We're not going to reveal them right now, but yeah, some fantastic titles coming up at different venues again. But how have you been? Have you been watching anything interesting lately?
Yeah, not seen too much. Been kind of busy, but with other things. But the two things that I've note, I mean, one I saw Room last week. We had Lenny Abrahamson here at Skyping in for an interview here at the School of Film and Television for the students. So I managed to catch that before that, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was. I mean, I'm a big fan of his anyway, and it's it's emotionally devastating in parts, but also really confident in its kind of eschewing of traditional narrative structure, and kind of being really interested in character and the impact of these monumentous events on the characters' lives, and really beautifully handled and a great central performance. And the other thing that I am loving is Louis C.K.'s Horace and Pete, part film, part theatre, part TV, part genius wonder thing.
So. Yeah, you've been telling me about this. It's something I really must check out when I get kind of 5 minutes to spare. But this sort of new. I suppose it's a new attempt to look at the way that transmedia works, or to adopt different formats and put them together in an interesting way, I suppose. I don't know, you can tell me.
So it's weird because as a stand-up comedian, he's been kind of selling direct to fans. So he records these specials or these shows, and he kind of directs everything himself and edits everything himself, and including his TV show, which is great as well. But he sells direct to his fans from his website. And then he released his feature film from the late 90s, Tomorrow Night. Again, kind of just put it out as a file, and he just, once you've got it, and you can download it as many times as you want, and it's pretty cheap and really, really good quality. And then so he's selling this new thing in this way, and he's literally just making it and putting it out within the space of a day or two. He's putting the episode, gets shot and edited, and then it's out into the world, and the only place to get it is his site.
It's an interesting question, though, isn't there, about whether somebody like that can do that and make it work for them because he's already gotten over the threshold of fame, and he's got all these collaborators who will come and do it with him. So you know what I mean? It's going through the traditional media in order to make the new media work, which is kind of problematic if you're just starting out and trying to make movies or make TV or make music.
Yeah, definitely. And it's usually kind of the high profile characters who kind of do this stuff. But I think what I find interesting about Louis C.K. is it's this kind of real kind of auteur commitment to doing it, and his TV show is shot for as little money as possible so that he could do it all himself, really. And there's something about his work which is really immediate, and he's kind of somehow managed to sidestep a lot of the things that comedians at that level have to do in order to maintain relevance, and kind of carved out a very significant body of work. And this new thing it's unlike anything else out there, because it's not a show. He's got his own show, and this is not. It's a weird thing. Very interesting. And the thing about it is that it's good. It's not this. It's really beautifully written, beautifully performed. There's a real melancholy tone to it, which is absolutely just so good.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I've seen recently. The last thing I saw was Spotlight.
Okay, I'm yet to see it, but I've heard good things.
I really liked it, but the reason I really liked it is because to me, it was just a sort of contemporary version of All the President's Men in a way.
Yeah.
There are so many scenes that you could parallel to that film, which is one of my favourites. I've watched it hundreds of times, and this sort of sense of, it's almost old-fashioned in the idea that the crusading journalists who kind of use all the methods within the professional ethics of journalism to get to their story, and it's just kind of hard work and this constant sort of search, and the questions of the questions of sort of morality are played out on the side of the journalists, because obviously they're searching into something that's completely immoral. I really enjoyed it, but I didn't, as a piece of cinema, it doesn't blow you away or anything like that.
Yeah.
Mark Ruffalo is it's a sort of erratic, weird performance. So I wouldn't say it was a great performance that would, with the Oscars coming up on Sunday, that I think, oh yeah, that was something that should have been nominated. And then I saw Sicario, but I mean, I saw a lot of great praise for Sicario. The problem was I watched it on my 11-inch laptop.
Yeah.
And I just get the impression that that's the kind of film that you just, you need to be in the auditorium with a great, good sound system and a great screening, because it was a sort of visceral experience. I mean, Emily Blunt was great in it, because sometimes you watch these films that have particular castings and you think that's a kind of star casting. It's like it's the old Meg Ryan as a CIA helicopter pilot scenario. Are you really going to buy that? But no, she's very, very good actually, I thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of needed to see that, I think, in the cinema to have the full effect.
I think it's interesting that there are still so many films that are clearly being made for that space. There's a lot of mid to high level kind of films that really do work very differently in that space, and often, that not as good when not viewed in that space, or a very different experience, I should say, rather than be kind of value judgments. So let's get into today's episode. What have we got coming up?
Sure. Well, this was the screening of Bronco's House, which is a new film by director Mark Jenkins, who is a good friend of ours. He teaches on the degree that you still teach on, and I used to. And he is, I don't know to describe him as a sort of British filmer, because I suppose, we get into this in the conversation. He's very much situated geographically and also sort of emotionally in terms of identity as a Cornish filmmaker. And he is also very much somebody who likes to push the boundaries of cinema in terms of its aesthetics in an experimental sense. We get into this idea of is he a proponent of pure cinema? And this film that he's made has been shot on film, on 16mm film. It's processed himself in chemicals that are derived from instant coffee. And he's very much of an ilk of using film, not in an old-fashioned nostalgic sense, but the idea of the craft of filmmaking produces a particular kind of aesthetic sensibility that is very different from digital, and that's one of the things we talked about.
Yeah, no, I've seen. I've seen the film, and sort of did a conversation with Mark at Port Eliot last year. And Mark, for those of you who listen to the podcast, will remember from the Point Blank episode, the Port Eliot special, because he joined me while you were sunning yourself in Croatia. And I think that the thing is, he is a friend of ours, but we saw real value in doing an episode around his film, because I think we were both really moved and engaged by it in a variety of different ways. And it's more than just kind of giving a friend a leg up. I think that there's things about the film and there's things about Mark as a filmmaker which are just really interesting, and I think that we wanted to kind of talk about in depth on the podcast. And
it's interesting because I think that I've done quite a few Q&As with directors, and I know that you have too. And out of anybody, I think as a director, he talks about film as well as anybody I know.
Yeah.
He's able to articulate how he sees film sort of philosophically, in terms of how he wants to make films for himself, but how he understands the medium in a wider context, which is always interesting to listen to when somebody can put films into those kinds of strands of thinking, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I interviewed Lenny Abrahamson last week and sort of talking about that, and there's something about certain directors where they understand cinema and they talk about cinema in terms of the language and the essence of it that just marks them out as cinematic artists and people. And I think Mark, definitely is someone that really he knows the difference between cinema and television, and and can articulate it, and his work understands the lineage of cinema as a visual form and an audio visual form, I should say, because sound is obviously key to his work as well. I don't want to kind of do him a disservice. So very excited to do this, and hopefully it'll be the kind of episode that we do more of in the future.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, there has been a couple of people who've contacted us about their films, and once I get a little bit of time to sit down and watch the films that they've sent, then if there's anything that we particularly like, then we're probably going to try and do this again in the future and get a director to sit on the stage and do it kind of in a Q&A form, but obviously tailored to what we do on the podcast.
Yeah. So the screening took place at the lovely Electric Palace in Hastings, in your neck of the woods, and thanks again to them for their support of the podcast. And let's go now to the introduction between Dario and Mark Jenkins.
Thank you very much for that. Welcome to the Cinematologists. We're back at the Electric Palace, and joining us all the way from Cornwall is film director and writer Mark Jenkins. So Mark, thanks for coming. Thanks for making it all this way here.
Pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
No problem. You've been, on the Cinematologists before, but we're actually discussing your film that's just come out, Bronco's House, tonight. I mean, how do you feel about having the film just getting out into the world?
Yeah, great. I mean, it's what you hope will happen, that an audience will watch it. So it's the bit when you're making the film that you dream of.
Yeah, so, it's a little bit of terrifying and exciting all at the same time.
Yeah, a little bit, but I get more nervous talking about it than it screening.
Well, hopefully we can get through that this evening. So before we actually get to Bronco's House, I wanted to talk a little bit about your kind of background and your influences and what got you into filmmaking in the first place. So, was there a sort of moment early on in your life that you thought to yourself, I'm kind of really interested in films. I want to make films. This is the medium for me.
I don't remember kind of remembering it at the time, but looking back, I think there was a few moments. There was my dad had from his childhood a little Disney projector that ran a little bit of, I don't know what gauge film it was, but ran these sort of cartoons through a projector, and I was obsessed with that. And I was also a bit confused because I thought it was a camera as well. So I used to try and
make your own Disney films.
Yeah. But so I've always been interested in the technology, which is kind of relevant to Bronco's House, going back to using that kind of technology. But I think there was John Borman's Hope and Glory. Was a big moment for me seeing that, because it was about a kid who was my age when it came out.
A bit different to the Disney films. Yeah, a bit of a jump there.
Walkabout was a big influence.
Right. And did you go to film school, or was there sort of an art college influence or photography?
Yeah, photography. I did a biology A level that I was rubbish at.
Okay.
And used to, at the sixth form college I was at, I used to skip the biology lesson, and I used to hide in the dark room. A mate of mine was doing photography, and I learned how to print off him, and got into photography. And then whilst doing photography, I got into shooting Super 8, and then from there got into film, and then went to Bournemouth, did a production degree in Bournemouth.
And what period was this? Is this sort of in the 1990s or?
Yeah, 90. I went to Bournemouth 95 to 98.
The reason I'm just asking that is where is it in relation to kind of digital? Because obviously we'll sort of come onto that. So you were on film from the start, as it were.
Yeah, sort of. I started out like a lot of people with high 8. A lot of people my age anyway, with a high 8 video camera or a video 8 video camera, and just filming your mates at school. And it's normally the schools that own these things, and making sort of terribly self-indulgent, supposedly funny little films, and then got into film through doing photography, because digital photography didn't exist at that stage. So I was doing celluloid photography, then got into film, and then I suppose just as I was finishing in 1998, Mini DV was just coming out.
Right. Okay. So we're just on the cusp.
Yeah, the first filmmakers to sort of start using Mini DV, I suppose.
Right.
Around when like Fest N was made, and The Idiots and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it was kind of like that whole notion of when digital was coming in, how it was going to influence film. With the Dogma 95 people and those particular films, was a big argument even at that point. Wasn't it?
And it was completely different, because now why I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but my total rejection of digital technology is for a completely different reason. Well, obviously, a completely different reason from me embracing digital technology early on, because mini DV was something that was so subversive in terms of it being so different to 35mm projection. It was to 35mm capture of images, and you could create something in a very immediate way with mini DV, and it was about creating an aesthetic that was different to film.
Right.
Rather than now, it's about resolution and all of these kind of things.
Right. We'll definitely come back to that. Well, you made a couple of short films, Golden Barn in 2001,
God,
I've written that down wrong. The Man Who Needed a Traffic Light. Obviously, I haven't seen either of those. But did you see those as sort of developmental films, or did you know what kind of filmmaker you wanted to be?
I'd look at them as developmental films now. But at the time when you make stuff, you think that's me, the fully fledged director is here. Yeah, exactly. I made Golden Burn and thought that's perfect. There you go. I don't have to make any more films. But then you look back and you do. Yeah, it's all part of a learning process.
So those two were in 2001, 2003, and then you make your first feature, Midnight Drives, in 2007. So there's a kind of gap there. Is that kind of indicative of trying to get a first feature together? Money and logistics and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, Golden Burn was a mini DV film, so I wrote a script, got a bunch of people together, and I was living in London at the time. We decamped to Cornwall, made it in a couple of weeks. It took about 2 years to edit it. When it was finished, it won a few awards at film festivals, and so then you start getting a bit of attention from the public funding bodies who want to give you money.
Sure.
But what goes with that is a huge development period, which slows everything down.
Yeah.
So then The Man Who Needed a Traffic Light, which was a very short, it was like 5.5 minutes. That was done with public money, sort of testing your working practices and whether you're going to be worth investing in.
Right, and did you get a sense back then that these funding bodies were kind of looking for particular kinds of talent and to bring them through? Was this kind of related to the Film Council and that kind of thing? I'm just, because there are students in the room, and how somebody gets to the point of making a first feature, I think is an interesting.
Yeah, topic. It was all Film Council money,
right?
And also because I was in Cornwall, it was Objective One money, so it was European money,
right?
Sort of regeneration money for Cornwall, but it was all administered by the Film Council, the regional agency,
right?
And they have they have these schemes where they're getting people to make their first professional short films, whatever professional means, their leap from a short film to a feature film and all that kind of stuff. So I was in those schemes.
And what kind of budget was it? If that's not too personal a question, I don't know.
What, The Man Who Needed a Traffic Light?
No. When you got to your first feature together, how much?
Was I think it was 36,000.
Right.
We had in terms of real money.
Yeah.
Which went up to about 50,000 with certain tax breaks and in-kind support from post-production.
And what was the bulk of that? Where did that go?
Wages. Right. I think that's the difference between something that's funded and not funded.
Yeah.
If you pay people, then your budget's gonna rise.
And Midnight Drives, correct me if I'm wrong, that's set in Cornwall, and very much a Cornwall fan. And I think I'm right in knowing you. I think I'm right in saying you're very much a Cornish filmmaker. So how much does that sort of position, that influence in place and space, kind of influence your filmmaking, your outlook?
I don't know. It's difficult for me to say because it's difficult to escape self and my experience. But I try to write about what I know about, and I think they're universal themes. But quite often, if I want the setting to be real, I'll write a setting I know, and that's Cornwall. So Midnight Drives was about a family who were visiting Cornwall.
Okay.
So the theme was kind of communicated through the dynamic of this family.
Sure.
But the setting, which was alien to and that was part of the drama, was very familiar to me. So there could be, the reality was there, I suppose.
Okay. And was there with that money coming in and with being sort of earmarked, let's say, as somebody who could potentially go on, was there any even pressure at that point to say, you need to have commercial awareness, or were you kind of given your own head? And because obviously, as we'll see, you've got very much a sort of experimental kind of approach, let's say.
Yeah, I think that people do lean on you to think commercially, because it's an art form that is dictated by market forces. But I think it's so inbred into the art form that you do that yourself. You put the pressure on yourself, and that's what I'm constantly fighting in myself, is to get away from thinking in that way, trying to get away from second guessing what I think an audience will like, because there'll be enough people who you're collaborating who will already be thinking like that.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes you've got to leave that behind and make the film that you want to make. But it is a fine balance, I think.
I think you've always got to try and fight that.
The second feature you made in 2012 was Happy Christmas. It was rather ironically titled Happy Christmas.
Yeah.
Not too happy at all. I remember watching it at the Cornwall Film Festival, and I was sort of struck by how uncompromising it was. It seemed that you'd gone, you know, you really had gone one stage further and thought, well, I'm not gonna be interested in the commercial stuff. So you succeeded in doing that. You know, it's got this sort of not particularly clear or obvious narrative, and you know, very poetic long takes and this kind of stuff. You know, did you really sort of have that in mind? I want to move more to this very sort of poetic language, or sort of poetic realism, I suppose, maybe.
Yeah, I think I was in development with various other films, and so I decided, because I hadn't made anything for a few years, I was going to make something, and I thought I was sort of jumping through all of those commercial hoops in development with other projects, and I thought, if I'm going to make something, I'll do it on my terms, and I did. Yeah, I rejected everything. I thought, how far can I go with something that is a narrative film, and I want to put it on the big screen and have an audience? How far can I push it before I completely lose the audience?
Well, I was going to come on to that. Is that how much does that factor into, you know, what you want to do going forward now after making that film? I mean, you know, I can imagine that you had, you know, real cineasts would have been, oh yeah, this is wonderful, you know, this reminds me of this, that, and the other, and then there would be a large hardcore of the audience would be like, well, you know, I couldn't stay in the room because it was so against what the mainstream normally does, is what I'm getting at.
If the audience is split in that way, I'm quite happy.
Okay.
I wouldn't want people just to say, oh, it's all right, and then not remember what they'd seen by the time they get outside.
Yeah. And so you know, the outcome of Happy Christmas was pretty much what you wanted.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it didn't, you know, it hasn't been screened a great deal. The idea, I didn't spend any money on it, or we didn't spend any money on it. So the idea is it would always be given away for free, and it was all set on Christmas Eve, and we released it just before Christmas, and we put it online for free as sort of like a Christmas present if somebody wanted to watch a really anti-Christmas film just before Christmas. You know, it was
right on my street, actually.
Yeah, well,
funnily enough.
I think for a lot of people, it was probably the least commercial thing that I could have done at that stage.
Do you see, though, going forward, that there is, with all the platforms that are out there, you know, you've just released Bronco's House, which is a video on demand. Is there now even more of a place for kind of cinema as pure art? However, that place is not going to be in the auditorium. These events are going to be like it is tonight, a sort of one-off event.
Yeah, I think so. But the sort of the complicated thing for me is, that those platforms are all there. But ultimately, I want to put my films on the big screen.
It's still the ideal for you, is the big screen.
Yeah, in a room, in a dark room, with no distractions. Right. Because I think with quite a lot of my work, it's quite difficult to watch if there's distractions going on. And a lot of work that I like, a lot of films that I like, I can't watch them if there are distractions. I'm not that focused to be able to, you know, sit down and watch Satan Tango for 5.5 hours if I've got my iPad near me or something. Yeah, you're not going to get sort of immersed in it, and I think that's really important. So I think that's what's important about venues, like this place.
But in that case, then how do you see the contemporary sort of British film industry from an exhibition standpoint? You know, with all of these, I mean, it must be really hard if you're trying to make a certain kind of movie you know is never kind of going to be picked up by any of the major chains in that sense. And then even if you made something which, you know, I know you've got plans for, that is more commercial, even then getting it on the screens in place of Avengers or Star Wars is going to be very difficult. Yeah,
I think you've just got to have the faith to think that the good will out, and if you do something that's worthy of an audience, you'll find an audience. But also, you know, I do despair, because I think British cinema is pretty rubbish in terms of what you get to see.
Right. Not in terms of content, or
yeah,
but there are the opportunities to see or
if you
produce.
If you don't make the effort,
yeah,
to find the interesting stuff, I think it's pretty substandard. If you blindly wander around and go into cinemas and see what's on, then I think from my point of view, there's no getting away from the fact that it's pretty dire. That's not to say there isn't great work being created,
sure.
but it's difficult to find, and it's rare to be able to see it in a space that most filmmakers want it to be seen.
Okay. So we'll move on to Bronco's house. Before, I'm not going to sort of talk about the film too much in terms of what happens to it. I'll let it speak for itself. But in many ways, it derives from this kind of manifesto that you set out in 2013. It was about this sort of philosophy of filmmaking and going back to using analog, using film and rejecting the digital. So, having said what we've just said, what's your sort of thinking behind that? What's the reasoning behind that?
I'd made Happy Christmas, and what I wanted to do with Happy Christmas was to create a way of making a film where there was very little equipment. And when I first started shooting it, I didn't have a car. My car was off the road, so I had kit that could be carried on the handlebars of a bike, because that was the first location I cycled to with all the kit on my bike.
Right.
And I wanted to simplify it and just have me, and it was self-shot, so it was me and the actors and the sound person and a couple of assistants in the room, and just get that intimacy back. And it was really exciting for a while, but then once I'd gone through the editing of it, which was really problematic because it was shot on a DSLR, which aren't the easiest cameras to use sort of during post-production, I just kind of lost the will to live, let alone the will to make films anymore. And I just sort of, and then so I had loads of detail, but I had to have an emergency operation, which meant I had an unexpected 2-3 weeks laid up on a sofa, not being able to do anything. And I just started thinking about what I was doing with my work, and sort of admitted to myself that I'd lost the passion for it, and then tried to retrace my steps back to where I was interested.
Okay. And
I went all the way back to the Disney projector and the film, and being able to put your hand in front of the light beam and all of that kind of stuff, and back to Super 8 really, and thought I'm going to go online and buy a Super 8 camera and start shooting some film. And I'd been sent home from hospital with this little note that said don't sign any checks or make any important decisions, because I was coming out of general anaesthetic, but it didn't say don't go on eBay. And I went on eBay and bought a Super 8 camera, which was the most expensive, is a Leica Super 8 camera.
So your entire film career from this point on is a drug-fueled trip, basically.
Yeah, and trying to pay back a debt.
Okay.
Yeah, and at that same time, that it was 2013. It was a digital revolution in cinema was in full swing. Yep. Stuff was being shot digitally, and cinemas were putting their 35mm projectors in skips, and labs were closing down, and all this kind of stuff. And that's obviously bad from my point of view. What was good was all the information that had been protected by the industry, because it had a huge monetary value, was suddenly in the public domain. So I was thinking, if I shoot Super 8, where am I? Can I still send my film off to Germany to get it processed and all that kind of stuff? And of course you couldn't, because Kodak had shut down that lab. But all these people who were still shooting film had worked out ways of processing it, and all this equipment from Eastern Europe, where they used to hand process all their stuff, was suddenly available on eBay. So I laid up on the sofa for 3 weeks. I just worked out that I could shoot film and I could process film in the same way that I processed photographs.
Right.
And I could be self-sufficient, and anybody could be self-sufficient. So, and then I wrote down a list of notes to remember while I was shooting film, so that I didn't shoot film in the same way as digital, because then I'd really bankrupt myself. I was shooting hours and hours, because Happy Christmas, we never switched the camera off really.
Yeah.
And I showed it to a mate of mine. He said, "Oh, it's like a manifesto." And so I thought that's a good idea. I've, embellished it and turned it into a manifesto of how to shoot small gauge film, shooting without.
Can you remember any of the points of the manifesto off the top of your head?
Yeah. It's got to be black and white.
Okay.
You've got to shoot silently in post sync. There's got to be a protagonist. There's got to be voiceover. No, only practical lighting, and then vague ones like. Make the film without making a fuss.
Okay.
Shooting ratio of less than 3:1, and then the final rule is, the 13th rule is you've got to break one of the other rules, which could be rule 13.
That's very meta. So that all of that comes out of the practicalities of working with this equipment, basically.
Yeah, it's a practical manifesto. Yeah, definitely.
And what do you say to the sort of contention that the idea of going back to film or trying to retain film is either A, kind of elitist, or B, nostalgic? I mean, it's something that gets leveled at maybe people like Quentin Tarantino and Christopher Nolan, where they sort of insist on, I have to shoot on film. And then when you sort of teach students, everything's on digital because it's easy, it's fast, it's cheap.
Why would it be elitist?
Because it's only available for those guys who are Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino. However, you're not that.
No.
So.
No, it's available to everybody.
Right. And it still is. There's still a lot of it out there.
Yeah, that's the thing. We're fed misinformation about it. Okay, you can buy film, and the thing I always say, people say digital is cheap, but you have to spend a hell of a lot of money before digital becomes cheap.
Right.
Even if you shoot on a DSLR, you might spend £700 up to $3,000 on camera and lenses. Then it's cheap. Whereas if you wanted to shoot Super 8, it's the opposite. You could buy a camera for £40, and then a roll of film is £20. You process it for pennies, and you can get a roll of Super 8 scanned to HD for about £7.50. So the elitist idea, I think, is wrong. The nostalgia idea, I think, possibly, but it's only a nostalgia because because people have stopped doing it. So if you stop doing something, you can then be nostalgic about it. So I'm not nostalgic about it anymore. I'm more in a position where I'm at risk of becoming nostalgic for shooting digitally. I might wake up tomorrow and think, oh, I'd love to go and shoot something on a DSLR.
Yeah. Well, you've been 3D by next year.
Yeah, shoot me.
So, do you want to talk a little bit about the development process just before we put the film on? This sort of using the coffee and this kind of thing.
Yeah. So like I was saying, that the all that information that was monetized is now in the public domain. So somebody said to me when I was asking about how complicated it was to hand process Super 8, somebody said, the emulsion on a piece of film doesn't know whether it's 35mm stills film or Super 8 or 35mm or 70mm. It reacts in the same way. And that was really inspiring to me because I suddenly thought, well, I still hand tank 35mm stills film all the time without thinking about it. And so actually I could do the same with movie film, the stuff that you used to have to send to Germany and all of this kind of stuff. You can just do it as long as you can keep the light out and pour chemistry in, you can process it. So I started off at first just processing with standard photographic chemistry, but then you use a lot more chemistry, and I was becoming a bit wary of where I was disposing of this stuff, and I didn't want to pour it down the sink, but I was having these buckets outside the studio of this
toxic waste.
Yeah. And I did actually speak to somebody. I said, how do you get rid of it? And they said, oh, you need to get somebody who's got a waste license to come and get it from you. And I said, well, what do they do with it? They said, oh, they pour it down the sink, but they're allowed to.
Oh, okay.
So I sort of felt a little bit worse about it. But where my studio is in Newlyn, I'm at the top of the hill, and at the bottom of the hill is the harbour, which has got a fishing fleet. And I was just thinking, like sort of Mr. Burns off The Simpsons, I'd be like pouring the stuff down, and then they'd be catching fish with 3 eyes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I did a bit of research and tried to find a more eco way of processing. And for years there's been a movement called Caffeinol, which are these photographers who process using a developer made of instant coffee, vitamin C powder, and washing soda crystals. And it's got the same properties as D76, which is the classic Kodak developer that everybody uses. So I just experimented with that and went to Poundland and bought sort of £50 of coffee at a time, and vitamin C powder and washing soda crystals. And
they thought you were having a party or something.
I don't know. Maxwell House party.
Yeah. Very good.
And that was and that was and that was it. And so because I was throwing away so much chemistry, I went that route, and it was cheap. That's why I say it costs pennies, because it really does. It takes half a jar of coffee, a little bit of vitamin C, and some washing soda crystals. So it's less than £1 to process a roll of film.
And does it sort of pain you a little bit to have to convert to Blu-ray? It's just, but that's just a fact of life.
Yeah, no, not massively, because that's where the audience are. The audience, and I count myself as a member of the audience. Are in the digital world, and so you have to go where the audience is. So I'm on Facebook and Twitter all the time promoting my work in these forums that I've got a love-hate relationship with, but I know I've got to go there to publicise my work. So going into the digital world, you have to do that. What I exploit is the fact that I don't have to be in the digital world to originate the work. So, the film looks great on Blu-ray. I think, hopefully.
Well,
and we've got a DCP of it, and it looks great. And as a digital print, I've never seen it as a 16mm print, because it would just be so complicated and expensive to do. And that the technology to do that in this country is pretty much gone now.
Right. And just on the film itself, do you want to, before we put it on, do you want to sort of give a little intro about how what the film is about, maybe in the broadest of terms, or?
Yeah, I mean, the film's about the housing crisis. It's about a young couple who are expecting their first child, and they're trying to put a roof over their head, and it's a very simple story. I think that's something that keeps coming up in the discussions I have, is people say the plot is very simple.
Great. And this is the first public screening?
First public screening since the film released on
Friday.
Yeah. Okay. So it's been festival screenings and one preview, and yeah.
Brilliant. So let's put it on. Let's watch Mark Jenkins' Bronco's House.
As long as there are children, and there is hope.
Don't forget, you can download the podcast from iTunes and Stitcher, or from our website, which is www.cinematologists.com. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can contact us via email at cinematologists@gmail.com. If you have a spare minute or two, we'd really appreciate a rating on iTunes. That really does help spread the word about the podcast and get us to new listeners. Thanks very much to all of you for supporting the podcast over the last year. But now, on with the show. So one of the things that we were kind of discussing there and getting to straight away was this sense of where a film like Bronco's House can fit in the contemporary cinematic context. I mean, it's a 16mm experimental, it's a narrative film, but not a straight narrative film. It's got quite a straightforward plot, so it's easy to follow in that sense. But it's 44 minutes long, it's in black and white. spoiler alert, it's not going to have the perfect ending for you to leave the cinema in with amazing happy thoughts in a Hollywood resolution style. So where does a film like Bronco's House sit in the contemporary cinematic context, Neil, do you think?
Well, I think what's interesting is that we have to ask this question of where it sits, because clearly the infrastructure is not built for a film like this. Whereas you kind of alluded to in the conversation, that the awareness of the fact that digital is the way that most people are going to see this in various forms, be it streaming online or downloaded or even kind of, projected digitally in spaces, suggests that the answer should be it can go anywhere. It just takes imaginative programming, and it takes kind of adventurous audiences. So the two areas that I would say are places that are still bound by this idea of a film is a 90-minute plus thing that is viewed by an audience and in 3 times a day, and also that we only go to 1 or 2 or 3 places to actually watch films in the first place. I think what I've been surprised about in terms of the so-called digital revolution, is that the promise of diverse content and diverse ways of programming has just simply never emerged beyond kind of a very niche festival and kind of and boutique programming. And it seems to me that with the way that people watch stuff, it should be open season. A film like Bronco's House, with its length, should just be programmed somewhere. It shouldn't have to be a certain length. And I think that the commercial thing in terms of is it a commercial piece of work is just lazy. And I think about that about a lot of films that I see straight on DVD or on Netflix or wherever. You just think, well, who decides what we see?
It's an interesting problem, because I think that sometimes I am very much of that ilk that you've talked about, that the programming isn't there. But also, at times, I don't think the audiences are there either, and this is the problem.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So, it's the two. It's the programming, but also this adventurous audience, which you kind of want to exist. It's where are they, and how do they even exist?
At the screening, when we were there was probably around 30. It's a 50-seater venue, so sort of 30 is a good number because it's it's over half full. But me and you, we both advertise on social media. Well, you're not on Facebook, but on Twitter. But I've advertised it on Facebook and through the university email. And, it is 7:30 on a Sunday night, but it is a film where you're getting the director there to discuss the film. And the people who came out, fantastic, really, really wonderful. But I'm just wondering, are independent cinemas, do they have... I think they have the wherewithal, but do they have the capacity to be able to screen something for more than just an economic sense? And is there enough imagination in the programming to be able to say that it takes more than just the film now? If you're going to put something on that is not widely advertised or widely known, there needs to be some kind of event around that, whether it's a Q&A or a series of shorts or something like that. I just don't know whether it is the fault of the programming of, like you say, boutique cinemas, or just the sort of behemoth of multiplexes and the kind of audiences that multiplexes have created.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that it is that kind of double-edged sword of the and I sometimes wonder if it's the kind of, I don't know, it's kind of nostalgic, isn't it? It's kind of looking back and thinking, I wonder what might have been, when the digital rollout happened, where the cinemas had taken a bigger stand, we would have got ourselves in this position. But part of that me thinks, well, maybe not. We've been on this kind of blockbuster road for so long. But
that was the promise, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The promise was there's going to be 20 screens, so 10 of those screens are going to have the recent British releases, and that's going to foster talent, and it just hasn't materialized. And what's happened is that the American film market dominates in the UK more than it does in any other kind of European country, and Britain itself has become essentially a craft repository for craft talent.
Yeah, we are a service industry. We're not interested in developing British film in any kind of coherent sense, and anybody kind of breaking through is breaking through out of sheer chutzpah.
I mean, it's the sort of Ben Wheatleys and Richard Ayoade's and these kind of people, and even if you're talking about the who's the Cornetto lot? I don't like the film. I don't remember. Edgar Wright. But in a sense, that is aiming at a very specific sort of fan market. Those particular films. I think Ben Wheatley's an interesting director, and I'm really looking forward to High Rise coming out. And also Richard Ayoade is obviously, I mean, I like his films, but I can, again, take him or leave him as a personality.
Well, I think, we've talked about Peter Strickland. We both love the Duke of Burgundy, and there are a number of really good British directors making work, and eventually they are kind of sort of, absorbed into the small system, which is, kind of Film 4, BFI. It's difficult to not be kind of downhearted, because at the end of the day, someone like Mark is making a really, really interesting and good piece of cinema and getting it out there, and it's I mean, it must be amazingly frustrating for him, because it's literally his blood, sweat and tears is in that, I mean, is in that film,
I mean, I think the only thing that you can sort of hope from that is that somebody does recognise that film does have an inherent cinematic value beyond simply its economic value, and that there is something more that comes from that, and he's able to make maybe a feature in that style, and someone allows him the leeway and says, right, we are making this for let's say the European festival circuit, and it's going to have its return, in those kinds of avenues. But it's just the fact that there isn't a clear space for that kind of film, and it has to be kind of carved out.
It does, but that great thing is that filmmakers, real true filmmakers, just keep carving, just keep whittling, and if he doesn't sell the film for a lot of money and doesn't get a big budget, not that I think he'd be interested in a big budget kind of offer afterwards, but it's not going to stop him making films, and that is kind of, there's a real joy in that, and I think that there's a joy in it because in a film like Bronco's House, that's what's on the screen, is that devotion to the form, and it just, you can't fake that, you have to believe in the form in order to make the film sparkle like that, and that's what he does, and filmmakers like him do that, and that's why I really like Ben Wheatley's work, because as low budget and as off kilter and as kind of strange as it is, you can feel in it there's a clear kind of decision to not just keep directing episodes of Doctor Who forever, but to really just kind of to carve out and say, I'm going to do this regardless. And I think that Ben Wheatley is someone similar to Mark in the sense that if Kill List hadn't have taken off, I think he'd still be making films, And the problem is that there's no sense of a British coherent move towards helping that kind of ability and that kind of energy on any level. So eventually it's just kind of like pat yourself on the back, welcome them in and give them money to make High Rise, which I hope is great. But it's that horrible kind of corporate thing of like, aren't we great helping these people? It's like, well, you don't help people at the level that you need to help them, which is when they're starting out. So yeah, and it's difficult. It is difficult to not get kind of really, really negative, isn't it? It's and I think it's because of, like you say, this kind of constant avalanche of, and I think, if you live in London and you live near Brighton, so you've got the Duke of York's, and there are certain urban centres where people might listen to this and think, oh, well, that's fine, but there's just too many places in the country where there's nothing, and it takes people like Mark going around with their film to drum up a little bit of sense of film culture.
I think, just looking slightly on the positive side, I think that there is a shift to venues that are purposely going out to be independent, and they're fighting. I mean, the Electric Palace is an example of that, and then there's a new place opened around the corner from me again, which is doing a similar thing. And this idea of the cinematic experience as an experience is being sort of marketed as the material. Again, using the same word over and over again, but the material experience is something that people are actually searching out because everybody spends so much time online and in front of their computers. So it's almost perhaps coming back round full circle again. And I think the more you have better independent cinematic experiences, the more that people will not be satisfied with that cold, alienated multiplex experience, which, Honestly, I avoid at all costs.
But the problem is, and I think that's to kind of bring it back to negative when I said I didn't want to, is that what's on offer in terms of content in those places is really, really important. The experience is part of it. Yes, you don't want the faceless, damp floored multiplex experience, but is just a comfortable seat to watch The Revenant and Star Wars enough, or does the programming then have to reflect? I think that's what's somewhere like the Electric Palace, I think, is brave in terms of letting us come along and program the trial and Bronco's house, and kind of support that, and that's what needs support. And I think that's what needs support, not just from local audiences, but that's what needs support at the level of, because I think you can make a corporate decision to make a nice, comfy cinema and screen Oscar-nominated films and Cannes favourites, but I think there needs to be some kind of support for venues who are really and honestly trying to engage with film culture in as diverse a form as possible.
And I think also it's funny because it's like that term that you use there, support. I think it requires a slight cultural shift away from, we're just supporting this because it's worthy to be supported. No, actually, these films are doing something that is proper cinema in a sense. And again, that sounds really kind of pretentious, but in a way it's getting away from the formulaicness of the way that stories are told, and the same kind of stories seem to be told over and over again, and the same kind of action product is produced or comedy product is produced. You know what I mean? They are doing something that is inherently part of the art form of cinema, and it's still happening amazingly, it's still happening despite all of the barriers that are up.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's the market-driven economy, isn't it? And it always comes down to the people who control the flow of the capital will always say, well, it needs to make money, and it's sad. And it was interesting because obviously Mark's film is very much about the flow of capital and market-driven forces. So yeah, it's there are things that could be done, but they are bold things that, like you say, rely on the value of something that is not strictly commercial. And increasingly, we don't live in that kind of world. So yeah, I think again that's why we think it's important to do these kind of episodes, because there is a duty to support the kind of work that's pushing against the tide.
Boundaries. Yeah, exactly. So, having said all that, I think we should get into our next section. So this is the post-screening Q&A with myself and Mark Jenkins.
Thank you. Wow, I'm kind of anxious, still recovering from that. Absolutely fantastic. Really pleased that you brought it to show us, Mark. And we're joined on the stage now by Colin Holt, who was actor, of course, that you saw, and evil, landlord guy, and did the lighting as well. So, in fact, that's where I wanted to start, was talking about the acting, because obviously the sort of very austere style, it reminded me a lot of kind of Robert Bresson films, where the actors are not doing the naturalistic thing on purpose. They're almost sort of ciphers for feelings and emotions. I mean, that's the way I read it. So is that from your perspective? How did you go about that?
Yeah, I was quite keen to get away from any ideas of realism, really, and that's partly to do with the form and the way that shooting on the camera we were shooting on, and the amount of stock we had. It had to be quite formal, and and I wanted it just to be kind of rigorous in the way it was put together. And so taking that to the ultimate was to remove any kind of realism from the performance as well.
And were you sort of worried about it maybe sort of falling into woodenness, as it were? You know?
Yeah. But then if the people have said that of Bresson's films, somebody can watch Bresson and go, oh yeah, it's all right, the acting's a bit crap.
Terrible,
as if that was that he was trying to achieve realism and sort of failed.
Yeah.
So but it is risky because we're so far down the line of performance being in a very specific way, which is this, I think what Mark Cousins coined closed romantic realism. And he's talking about the whole film language, but within that very prominent is this attempt at realism and naturalism through performance.
Sure. And how did you find like dealing with that and sort of staying within that meter, as it were?
Yeah, naturalism is the word that was springing to my mind, where this almost felt like more of a performance to be less of a performance, if that makes sense. You were kind of being held back from all the things that you would assume were normal, realistic. It was like just less, to the point where I would say, but this seems very kind of stilted, and you just like, that's how I want it. So I just learned to shut up and just get on with it.
Just get on with it.
Yeah.
Do what the director says.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And did you have very specific kind of aesthetics in mind in terms of the characters? Because obviously the girlfriend, we don't know her name, has a very sort of arresting visual, as does Bronco. And were those guys people you had in mind?
Yeah, I always wanted to write something for Henry, who's the lead actor. He's a filmmaker himself, and I just think he looks great, and he looks, for want of a better word, I think he looks cool. He's got a beautiful face. He's got a beautiful look. May was in Happy Christmas, and she photographs brilliantly. She really comes alive on the screen. So I thought that would be a great couple that, without meaning to sound shallow, it is an aesthetic medium, and I just wanted two people who looked interesting and looked beautiful together, and then built it around there. The good thing is that because you're not asking for a huge amount of technique in terms of conveying subtext through text and naturalism and all of this kind of stuff, you can. I felt I could cast a little bit outside of where I might normally cast, so I could cast pretty much on looks and physicality.
Right, and it was quite a short shoot. Was that right? How long did it take for the?
It was 10 days,
right.
And then we did 2 weeks, Monday to Friday, and then we came back and shot the stuff out at sea a little while later, because we shot in March and the harbour was actually closed, so we couldn't get. But you can see, if you look very carefully, you can see in some of the shots the actual bulks are down in the mouth of the harbour, and you can't get in and out of the harbour. The stuff we shot at sea, we decided to do a bit later when it was a bit warmer. So we did that in June. We did about a day and a half, where Jesse, who plays the stranger, had to dive into the sea. Right. We waited till the sea had warmed up a little bit. Yeah.
And how did you find sort of the technical aspects of working within these parameters that Mark had set out? Were you kind of like, okay, or were you a bit like, this is a bit mad? You know what I mean?
But, as an actor?
No. In terms of the lighting stuff.
Oh, I see.
Because
I lit it as well with Mark, and it was one of those things that just, to be honest, it was foisted upon me quite suddenly, because I knew I was going to be in the film. And then I think Mark was, I don't know, I'll take it as a compliment. He said, do you want to light it as well? And it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll keep costs down. So, I knew basics of 3-point lighting. And I sort of said that up front. I said, look, I've never lit something on this scale before. And my techniques are sort of more to do with news camera lighting, very simple interview style lighting. And he said, no, that's absolutely fine. Look, we've got 3 lamps. Let's just work with what we've got. And so it sort of turned into a sort of rolling challenge whereby you'd be just trying to augment the practical light that we had. It was almost, again, it was one of those things where it was a delight to have a limitation. You didn't have 100 lights to choose from. You just had those 3, make those 3 work. And almost literally in some cases. And so it was great to have that challenge. And it was a pleasure to work with some of those guys, as you say. Aesthetically, they were very pleasing, beautiful to light, and it was good. It was good. It was all good.
And I think, in a lot of ways, it was like a photographic shoot at some points, because there's not a massive amount of movement with the camera. There's not a massive amount of movement within the frame, so we could spend a bit of time setting up the camera, and then we would light it, and then we would both agree or disagree, or decide to do something else. And then when it was all set, it was just simply let's press the shutter and and we'll go.
It's kind of interesting because one of the criticisms that's levelled against contemporary films is that they cut too fast and you don't have time for contemplation. Whereas you had to cut quite quickly here because there wasn't that long enough roll of film. But yet there seems to be time to contemplate the image. So it's quite an interesting balance you've managed to strike between the length of shot and giving the audience time.
Yeah, and I think it's all relative because it's the quick cutting thing. If it's relentless, then I think that's when it becomes a problem. But there are moments. The camera runs for 28 seconds maximum run, so there are shots in there that are almost 28 seconds. If you put that in amongst quite a lot of montage, suddenly that feels like a longer shot, a very long shot. Yeah. And also, if it's in the right place, it gives a pause and it allows you to assess what you've seen in a montage, and then that gives you the right to go back into that quick cutting again, I think. So it's an editing thing as much as a shooting thing, I think.
Okay. I think we'll open it out and ask if anybody's got a question or a comment. Does anybody want to make a Great.
Hello. I quite found the form of the film quite interesting, and I was just wondering how much of that came in the writing or how much of that came in the edit. Thank you.
The whole thing, it was written very much with the shoot in mind. So it was written very specifically for the form that was going to realise the script, and it was also everything was storyboarded. So every single shot was storyboarded, or if it wasn't storyboarded because it was too complicated to draw and I didn't have the skills, I would do a detailed floor plan where the camera was going to be and where the characters are going to be. So it was very sort of detailed in that sense. What happens with the ends of the film? So when you first load the film, obviously you fog a bit of the film. You don't quite know how much of it you fogged. So that first bit you fire off, you can't do anything that's really essential to the film with that bit of film, and the same goes for the end of the film. So those points, I would get the camera and point it at something else and get cutaways, which were quite often quite random because they would just be from what we could grab in the area. That became the sort of unknown. That was the thing that hadn't been planned for. So there's quite a few landscape shots, for example, at the end where the phone's ringing and you see the different phone lines. That was just shots that we just grabbed when we were going to shoot something else and we didn't know whether that was going to come out, so we would just film a bit of something.
You talk a lot about the kind of accidental nature of things and the unpredictability and almost the problems perhaps, or that the outcome's not being a problem if there's discontinuity, because there are moments when it doesn't matter that the editing doesn't quite kind of sink in the continuity way. Yeah. But you're all for that. I mean, it's just the point of the film.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's something really beautiful in those limitations and the decisions you're forced to make in the edit. So there's the bit where the stranger gets out of his van when he sees the girlfriend on the end of the quay, and you see him once in the van, and then you see a close-up of her on the quay, and then he stood a little way away from the van. And Denzel, who produced the film, when he saw the rough cut, he was like, I love that sort of Nosferatu moment where there's that impossible movement. And I said, we forgot to get the shot showing him. And it was forgotten in the storyboarding. I never drew a storyboard of it, so that it never had a chance of being shot because it just was never on the list. And then you make a decision, and it's almost as if it would be really interesting to do a film like that, storyboard it, and then get somebody to break into your house in the middle of the night and steal every other storyboard or something. And then you go and film it, and you get to the edit and go, right, I've got to make that same story out of this. And I think we would just move the art of editing on a decade, by making films like that where you just haven't got those chances to do
everything isn't spelt out bit by bit. Yeah.
And you have to reappropriate stuff. So there's a lot of the dialogue scenes, the actors were never in the same location at the same time. And so you end up grabbing little bits between performance and stuff as cutaways and things like that. And that's where, for me, that's where the interest comes.
Sure. Anybody else like to ask a question? Go ahead.
Firstly, obviously, thank you for coming all the way over here and showing the film. The kind of the limitations which you implicate upon yourself. Are you a kind of advocate, I guess, for sort of self-limitation when exploring artistically? Do you feel as though it kind of makes the creative juices? Does it sort of force them to flow? Do you know what I mean? And do you feel as though film is a better advocate for that than digital?
Yeah, completely. I think the more limitations you've got, the better. I think there's nothing. I think Bob Dylan said in a recent song, "I'm as helpless as a rich man's child." And I think if you've got all of the resources, then I don't, personally speaking, I don't do anything. If there's endless possibilities, and I just spend the whole time thinking about it. Whereas if you're given a really small amount of chances or opportunities, creative opportunities, then you just make the most of them. My partner's little boy, who is 7, he goes to an after-school club called Construction Club, and what they do is the teacher just gives all of the kids just a handful of Lego, and they have to go and make something with just this little bit of Lego. And I just think that's brilliant. At home he's got loads of Lego, just make anything, that tends not to. But Construction Club comes away with these incredibly interesting things. And I just look at that and I think that's exactly what I want to do. Take all of that away, like taking half of storyboards away, take half of script away. On the first day, have half your stock taken away. And I think if you can replicate that while you're working digitally, while I was in pre-production for Bronco's House, I was making a documentary and I was shooting digitally, and I was just shooting hours and hours and hours of stuff. I had 2 32 gigabyte compact flash cards in a camera, and I would just fill them up, and then I'd go home, and then what I did after that is I got a 4 gigabyte compact flash card, and that's the only one I took. And so I would shoot, fill it up, and either go home, or else I'd review it all and delete what I didn't want. And it made the editing a joy, because 1, you didn't have to trawl through hours and hours of exactly the same footage, and 2, you had to go, right, I haven't got enough to tell a story in the way that I thought I wanted to tell it. How am I going to tell it with these tools that I've got? And then again, that's where the innovation comes from, I think.
I think maybe the sort of some of the issues with digital filmmaking and the fact that people shoot forever and ever and ever, it makes anything, it makes all images kind of equal in a sense, and especially in this film, you've got to make those selections quite carefully in a way, which is totally against how contemporary films get made on digital.
Yeah, definitely. You do. We didn't shoot anything until we were absolutely sure that's what we wanted.
Like how the finger hovering above the camera. So, should we really
totally,
honestly?
Because you're conscious, because you're literally, you're hearing money run through the camera. You have to make those choices and get them right before you shoot, not afterwards. You don't get the chance to review. It's old school. It's in there, but you cannot see that until you develop it, which may be whenever. There was one time when it had to be that night, didn't it, where we realised we might have been shooting with a hole in the camera, so you were forced to go and just print a reel up or expose a reel, then to find out whether things were all right.
Yeah, I had to process a roll overnight because I thought
we thought lost everything.
Right. Just didn't know. And but also, there were times within that universe of film, because we lost one of our locations, didn't we? We had to chop that down because we were sort of truncated in one particular location we were using, and so you're just having to make these choices on the fly, which I think they were easy to do because you don't have that sort of endless thing where with digital there's no limitations. You just keep going, doesn't matter. You're forced to make sometimes really difficult decisions, but they're always good ones, I think.
Yeah, and everybody ups their game. That's the other thing. Is that thing of your finger hovering over the shutter. Everybody knows that, and there was very few times when actors fluffed their lines or or technical mistakes, because everybody was so focused.
From an acting point of view, that drives up the element of performance, because you do feel almost like doing live theatre. You have to get it right because you don't have the opportunity / the money to go again. So it does actually up your game. It ups everyone's game. You're absolutely right.
Who else? Oh, at the back.
I'm just asking, when you were recovering from the operation, you said that you were on the sofa for 3 weeks. Was it during those 3 weeks that you thought what medium you wanted to make the film in, or what the film would be, or both?
It was just about the medium.
So you already had the story.
Well, this... Yeah, I mean... when I was on the sofa, I wasn't thinking about making a film that was this long. I was thinking about experimenting with I'd make sort of diary style films that are a lot shorter, and I decided that I would start shooting those on film. It didn't really go as far as thinking about this, but in answer to the question, I had this story already because I'd been commissioned about 10 years ago to write what the producer described as a Cornish full Monty. So it was when just after the full Monty had come out, it was a producer from Sheffield, and he commissioned me to write 3 treatments for a film that was going to be the Cornish full Monty. So about the housing crisis in Cornwall and an underdog story and all of this kind of stuff. And I wrote the most unfull Monty, Cornish full Monty, and it was basically this story. And so when I started shooting film again, I was looking for a longer project. I went back to this and thought, could I reinvent that into something that could be shot according to this manifesto?
And what was your sort of thinking behind the woman who was about to have a child, her beginning a relationship with another man? Was that a kind of comment, in a sense, on where things get out of hand, where people don't have any stability of where they live, or that wasn't the main thrust of it?
It depends how you read the character, the stranger, and who that character is, I suppose, would be the question.
Well, he owns a boat.
Yeah.
Was whether he's the father or not?
No, whether he is a character in his own right or he's
a figment.
Does he represent part of one of the other characters in the film?
Do you know?
Yeah, sometimes.
But in a sense, though, was there a sort of feeling about you wanted to make a film that did say something about homelessness and about work and these things that, they are big issues everywhere, but they are big issues in Cornwall, aren't they?
Yeah, well, the funny thing was that when this producer, the Sheffield producer, came to speak to me and wanted to commission something set in Cornwall, the housing crisis in Cornwall was a really big issue, and it was a bit of a kind of fluff piece in the broadsheets in the summer, because a lot of the broadsheet journalists or whatever, I suppose, were coming down to Cornwall on holiday and thinking, oh, this is a weird disparity between people on holiday and the people who can't afford houses down here. So there would always be a bit in the press in the summer. And I think that's what the producer was kind of interested in. Was there more to this story? By the time we came to make this, everybody was talking about it. The housing crisis was a very common term. And I think because it was happening, because of what was happening to London, probably, then that the agenda changed, and so it became a more universal story. And cynically speaking, I was thinking, well, that my very uncommercial project could have a commercial element if we're talking about a contemporary issue. Yeah. And then, but I didn't really want to make a comment about the issue of housing. It was more about the individual's attitude to power. I think individual power within a community, and how much power people perceive they have, and then what they choose to do with that power. And I think in the world of the housing crisis.
Any other? One at the front here.
Yeah, some lovely shots in the film. I really enjoy watching it. And you say that the 2 people you chose, I think, were lovely just to look at, and the stillness of it all, and the not acting. I act sometimes, and just seeing that not acting, just the very still faces were great. There's one shot in particular of the girl with the hair blowing in the breeze, looking up at a kind of very white background. It reminded me of the 1940s style American magazine covers. Was that in your mind for that shot especially, or was it just another really nice shot you had?
Yeah, well, we were on the end of the quay in Mousehole, and so we've got this incredible sun reflecting off the sea and giving this amazing look, and I think there was some pretty nifty reflector work going on there to direct the sun. So no, there was nothing sort of planned about that shot. There was no reference points, but I think as soon as I'd processed it, and what I did is I used to look through the negative on the light box with a loop, and those frames just jumped up. And I think that was the point where we kind of thought, and that's the poster image as well. we made the white space even bigger. So she's at the bottom left-hand corner of the poster and all this white space. I think as soon as people saw that frame, it was like, that's got to be the poster image, which is nothing like what I thought, because the film is called Bronco's House. So the thought was always, there would be Bronco and maybe a house, if we were being really literal. But then suddenly there was this image, and I think it just captured the form as much as anything, which was really important for this film. So. Yeah, but I think everybody kind of recognised that straight away, including May, who's in the image, who is in that picture, who did say, "There's the poster," which is really modest.
She reminded me a bit of the woman in La Jetée, the Chris Marker film, which is also a series of frames.
Yeah. No, it's good. Yeah.
Did you have another point? Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Obviously, cinema is an illusionary medium, and in kind of, I suppose you recognise the illusionary, fact of cinema by, non-acting and using black and white, which obviously conventional cinema doesn't really do. In doing so, do you feel as though you're able to critique society more honestly by recognising the illusionary nature of cinema? And you can I found that in doing so, you kind of highlighted the illusionary nature of society insofar as that, children are born with hope, and the reality sets in that the hope will always remain hope, and it will never actually, come to fruition, if you see what I mean, because of the powers that be.
Yeah, well, and I think that line, the opening line of the film, which is, as long as there are children, there is hope, is also married together with the character turning round and immediately breaking the fourth wall. So the idea is, and part of that, a lot of that is just being playful with the form and saying, this is in a lot of ways, it's quite heavy, the film, and it's quite bleak, but being playful with that form and saying, you're constantly watching a film. We're not going quite as far as, like, say, Godard would in Weekend, where, you can turn to a character and say, are you an extra, or are you, that kind of thing. But just I think there's a certain amount of freedom in that I enjoy, and the artifice of it, and the suspension of disbelief is such an incredible thing that you can constantly remind somebody they're watching a film, but then you can still be, a few seconds later, you can be emotionally invested in it, and it's just a light shining at a wall, and that is kind of fascinating, and the artificial construct is really important for me, I think.
The back.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask you about the role of the women in the film. That it seemed that while the men had the money, the landlord and the stranger, and the women, the pregnant woman seemed quite powerless, and the sister also. They both kind of figured out how to get what they wanted through sex. And the only strange bit of power that I thought the pregnant woman had was obviously that hint, like kind of a stalker with the fish coming towards her, suggesting she might have some kind of spiritual power. And then I loved it when she whispered to the guy, you've got to go further out to get fish, because I like the kind of the use of kind of local knowledge to hint at the man's greed that would be his ultimate downfall. And I'd be interested in other films that you've made and the role of women in them.
Well, just to sort of address the first point, I think what the girlfriend, the main female character, I think that the point, she holds the ultimate power, which is, the cyclical nature of the film. It starts talking about children. If there's children, there's hope. She is the one who provides the next generation, who maybe won't be as corrupt and as, screwing each other over. So I think that's what I was trying to get to. The sister character is playing the man's game. Is playing that kind of aggressive, powerful. Whilst having no power, effectively. Being powerless in in that world, because when it comes to housing, the only thing that matters is money or property, and she can't engage in that game. And I think her big the flaw of that character is she does succumb to that, and that sort of promise of something, if she offers herself, she gives into that in the end, but it results in nothing. And that's the that's the sort of tragedy of that, really. In terms of my other in my other work, I mean, the film that I'm moving on to next is a story of warring brothers in a fishing village again. But at the centre of it, the soul of the story is this young girl who is supposedly much maligned, but to be the future of the village. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Of like old, well, almost like Wicker Man and all those folk, the folk tales. And I don't know if you've seen. There's a great 50s Greek film called Evdokia, which might be interesting to look at. This kind of wild woman in a disintegrating community. Not that Cornwall's disintegrating, but just places where it's quite fragile communities in a way, because few people. I really enjoyed it, so thanks very much. Yeah.
Have we got time actually just for one of the shorts? Maybe, Rebecca, or are we? Yeah.
Yes. Because it's the shortest.
Yeah, that's the shortest. But Mark has brought some of his shorts with him. I think we've got time for one. Maybe we can put just one on very quickly.
As the sun headed west, the bus dropped me in the shadow of Malfra Hill. The road to Zena. Christopher McCandles wrote, "Joy is only real when it's shared, and the curious joy in the warm passing of time is most acute in the long shadows of the end of the line autumn coming stillness. Silence." Then, stern farmer, 4x4, mud-splattered what you doing up here face, then gone. The light divided the land into strips beyond Chai-Kembro Common towards Carngalva as I pushed down on the shutter. You may not be able to peer over the edge of the sea or into the valleys folded between the Carns, but lives are being lived, and the smoke from a chimney or the innocent do-they-don't-they-know faces of the cows and the crazy paving older than the pyramids fields are a guarantee of permanence, just like the shutter and the camera and the familiar sound of the procession of ghost images caught and kept alive for us for 100 years or more. Silence. A dog barks somewhere off. Somewhere a god laughs. A contented laugh. The road brows and in front descends. I look down at impossible angles and hear sounds come back up, disconnected, ahead and behind, all things connected, all time in one place, great ancient future. I hedge my bets and light a candle for you in the church and say a prayer to the sea from the cliff.
So that's the road to Zena. You want to tell us a little bit about the voiceover, the narration?
It's that was my last ever roll of Ektachrome, which was a Kodak color reversal stock, the last color reversal stock Kodachrome made, and I've been saving it for ages. And so I decided to go up to Zena and walk this road that I like walking. And I wrote the voiceover, and it's partly relating to a person, but also partly relating to this roll of film, sure. Which why you hear me talking, well, it's voiced by Mary Woodvine, but it's obviously my words talking about this roll of film, right. And lamenting its loss.
And really sort of vivid colours as well. You know, it's incredible when you juxtapose it with the black and white as well, what we've just seen.
Yeah, well, that's colour reversal stock. That's what I don't mean to sound like a film geek, but that's what reversal stock looks like. That's the classic, like Kodachrome 40, which was the stock that everybody grew up with.
Yeah, and it's so different to that blue tinge that you get to digital. You know what I mean?
Blue tinge.
Blue tinge.
The blue tinge.
It's, it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Maybe chance for the last couple of questions if anybody wants to add anything else.
There was a bit when there was the film was rolling and there was a mention of camera and then a mention of silence. Are you trying to, I guess, adhere to the kind of effervescence of film and the kind of how without the actual invention of film, there's that which has happened in the world, which if it wasn't recorded would be, lost forever. You know what I mean? There's that kind of, and I guess that kind of that relates to the actual like Kodak film in that, while you are filming it, that it's going to be, gone as soon as you stop rolling the camera.
Yeah, I think it is. It's related to why I'm interested in film, which is, I'm quite interested in this idea of mono no aware, which is the it's defined as the gentle sadness that's associated with the passing of time. That's why you can look at something and sort of feel sad and joy at the same time, and it's to do with nostalgia as well. Dario, you mentioned nostalgia. It is that kind of why you look at something utterly beautiful and it makes you cry, and it's because that moment will never happen again. And I think what I love about film and photography is it's a really valiant attempt to capture that and keep it in its most basic form. You can do it in poetry, you can do it in painting, you do it in music, you try and capture these moments and keep them alive. But with photography, it's such a literal thing, and film is photography. That's what it says, a procession of ghost images, 24 images a second, that are an attempt just to keep hold of that beauty that moves you in the moment, so you can go back to it and hopefully it will move you again.
Well, I think that's a good place to finish. Just remains to say thank you very much, Mark, for coming all this way. It's been a fascinating evening. Thanks to Colin as well for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks to Edward and Daisy and Abby, our student crew, for doing the audio. Thanks to Electric Palace. Thanks to you all for coming. If you want to download the podcast, it's at www.cinematologists.com. There's also a link to the film, so please spread that if you use social media. And hope to see you again next time on the podcast. So obviously in the previous segment we discussed quite a lot of context about Bronco's house. So let's get into a little bit about the film itself. I mean, we've both basically said that we like the film, but I think it goes a little bit more than that. I think there's a lot, to really discuss and a lot to think about with a film like this. So what did you make of it?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it when I saw it. Yeah, it's...
It made me feel quite anxious. Seeing it, just to sort of... I saw an original cut that Mark did, which was kind of like a test screening among friends and stuff. And it was completely different, this cut. It was amazingly tightly put together in terms of the way that the editing was kind of like... It had these kind of quick cuts from one scene to another. But within that, it left you enough time to contemplate the imagery that was on the screen, which is a very fine balance, I think.
Yeah, and the imagery is incredibly powerful. Like you say, not only in terms of its composition, but in the way that it's constructed as a visual narrative. And I love the faces. I love the casting. And his appreciation for faces, and just his willingness to let the story be told in a variety of different ways, like you say, through editing, through sound, through just the people's faces and movement, and I think anxious is an interesting word. It made me angry, made me really angry in the way that, that something like Paths of Glory makes me angry. It's not explicit, but there's this kind of implicit kind of injustice that kind of just rumbles along. But it's never a preachy film. It's never like, oh, the world is bad. It's just, there's a sense through the actions that the characters are kind of go through and put themselves through a lot of the time that, that there's just really kind of dark sense of kind of turmoil at the heart of it, which speaks to something bigger. And I think what's interesting about the film for me is that it's both very, very Cornish, but also it's very, very, it's wider than that. It speaks to,
there's a universal kind of portent, let's say, about the way in which we are individuals, and our individuality is related to is defined by the people around us and how we affect other people. But also, I think there's a sort of sense that society, almost sort of controls every aspect of our lives at the same time. So, there's even a sort of allusion to, do we have freedom? Is there a sort of universal sense of freedom that people actually possess, or is everything kind of beholden to your social situation?
Yeah, I think, and it speaks to the erosion of a certain kind of way of life, and that is, that could be replicated in Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, any kind of any place where industry was the lifeblood of a community, and the fact that society somehow, not as a sentient thing, but kind of erodes the infrastructure and leaves the people behind, and then new people come in with a completely different agenda and a different set of circumstances, but those people are still there. And the sense of ghosts, these people are just kind of ghosts in their own place, I think is very strong. And I loved it because as well, because it's not just doing all of that kind of like it's not a soapbox film, it's aware of a variety of different types of cinema, both social realism, but also kind of a bit more kind of magic realist, kind of surreal, kind of 60s, 70s art house film. So, and it blends the two really well. You get this kind of Bergman kind of Tarkovsky-esque thing.
It's even Antonioni as well, because it's sort of that idea of there's a lot going on, even though there seems to be not a lot going on at all.
Yeah, and people and place. And and kind of the relationship between people and place. So, it's a film that kind of excites me because it's someone that doing things that you just respect in the way that you respect good cinema, regardless of who makes it. So
one of the things that came up there in that in the Q&A that Rebecca asked, actually, who is the founder of the Electric Palace, and she talked about the female characters and the sort of the idea that the female characters in this didn't have any power, and it's and Mark's answer to that, about the idea that actually the central female character in a sense has all the power. But it was an interesting point, I thought, because it led me to sort of think, are we in that place now where we have to be kind of ideologically aware at all times that a film has to have a kind of obviously strong female character in order to make that statement? Do you know what I mean? I always find, because we have this discussion a lot on the podcast, the fact that it's just two blokes talking about this and trying to mitigate that. But it's an interesting question, I think.
I think it is, and I think it's it kind of makes you bristle, doesn't it? Because you are very aware of responding to it, intelligently and articulately and appropriately, without kind of coming off as because it doesn't matter, in this circumstance, But I think that there is a danger that, because I think this is again a bit twofold. I think there's a danger that you dilute every type of story by trying to make it hit every kind of politically correct or every kind of diverse
ideologically aware representation.
Every kind of representation needs to be at the same level, and that will inevitably make some films lesser. But I think the problem is that it really means that certain types of films are held up to higher scrutiny, generally ones that focus on a white male protagonist, because that is the dominant form. So any film with a white male protagonist suddenly becomes yet another film with a white male protagonist. And I think that so many films, particularly in the last couple of years, have not really, respected that responsibility. But it also means that some films are criticised when, the context under which they're operating is, it necessitates representation in a certain way because of what the film is about and what it's trying to do. And it's very, very complicated because there's not enough balance at the moment to be able to say, well, this is a good example of a film that has a white male protagonist that has certain kind of long-standing representations of female characters at the heart of them.
It's a key point, that, and what's interesting to me is that obviously Bronco's house is set in a certain kind of rural community that is, by implication or by reality, is probably beholden to much more traditional patriarchal notions of the gender structure, let's say, if we want to call it that. So therefore, in a story like that, if the female characters don't have power in that story, then you could end up kind of manufacturing a inauthentic aspect just so that you're conforming to what is ideologically correct in a wider context. Now, the problem with that, with what I've just said, is I think that you can find ways to nuance that, to show that power dynamics just don't flow from one to the other. They are, constantly moving all of the time. And that's what I actually think Bronco's house does, because there is that moment where one of the women characters, the sort of the friend, ends up sleeping with one of the male characters simply to try and smooth the deal, as it were. But I think that the lead female character is almost as, obviously the film is about Bronco, but it really isn't. To me, the film is about the girlfriend. That's not that she doesn't have a name. That's actually, we don't know what her name is, but that's what she's called. So I think it's more complex in this film than perhaps it might seem on a surface reading, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think because Bronco doesn't have any power. He's the male at the centre of the film, and he really has no power. He is an example of a man who has had power removed from his situation, by dint of geography and class and all these kind of things, and upbringing, and so I think that a lot of the time the representation of female characters in films is valid when placed against kind of aggressively strong male character, but in this film that's not the case, and I think that it is more complicated, and I think it's good to raise these questions, and I think that it's important to understand the complexity, but also to kind of say, well, yeah, this is an example where the representations are key, but that the female representations are key in relation to the male representations as well, and that there is, like you say, kind of a bit more going on than just, the women are taking the traditional roles. What I like is that those questions are being raised, and women are raising those questions. Female students are raising those questions all the time, and most of the time I say you're absolutely right in terms of that's a very negative portrayal.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I think that is true. 95%.
No, exactly. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like we're not saying that at all. I think, but within this particular film, I think there is sort of nuances to that.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, it's you don't want to kind of leap to the defense of the film because it's made by a white man and we're white men, but it is important that films that are complex in terms of their representations are not lumped into the same category as everything else. Not that I think that your audience that Rebecca was doing that, but
no,
that's an important ongoing conversation, and I think what's really encouraging is that as a lecturer in film, I have that conversation a lot, and I love that conversation because it's encouraging that slowly female students are kind of feel confident enough to be able to raise it and not be shut down. And we did some interviews for new students next year, and I had 3 female students who actively addressed the role of women in film as a career and as a representation, in their interview to be on the course. And I've not had that before, that they were very open about and honest about, well, what does it mean for a woman? And small signs, but encouraging, particularly because we like that kind of debate.
I think Rebecca was generally interested in what Mark's response was to that question, which was absolutely great. And he, is very considered about it. Just to finish off then, I think the last thing to sort of talk about that really interests me about the film, and you can tell this by the fact that we left on the sound to The Road to Zena, which was the short film that we screened alongside Bronco's house. We left that deliberately on the podcast because I think Mark is obviously very interested in the way that the role that sound plays in his film. And I remember when he came to the Goddard screening, the Band Apart screening, we talked a lot about the way sound figures in. But it's just amazing to listen to it in editing the podcast. It's been great to listen to the audio.
Yeah, and I think it's, as we sort of said before, he's a cinephile. He's someone who really understands cinema, and true cinephiles understand that film is an audio-visual medium. And Mark loves talking about the dream space. I think on In the Mood for Love episode, he can be heard talking about it's so important. The audio in terms of creating that almost three-dimensional space in films is vital to the experience of the state of cinema. And it's never taken for granted, or it's never easily done. And I know he talks a lot about just even the recording of the audio being dubbed afterwards. It's that level of thought into the entirety of the film, which is as a sound artifact as much as a visual artifact that kind of makes Bronco's House worth championing in this way.
Brilliant. So we're nearly that will nearly do it for episode 20. Neil, do you want to just tell us about the next episode, because you've already recorded the audio for that?
Yeah, we had a screening of The Hunger, Tony Scott's feature debut from 1983 this week, and that was a really, really fascinating screening. We were joined by a colleague, Victoria Bayard. I should say Dr. Victoria Bayard. She's just literally in the last day or two had her revisions confirmed, so she's now officially Dr. Bayard, and she joined us. She joined us on stage because Kingsley was laid low with the flu, and it was a really interesting screening. And what came out was some fascinating stuff. So I'm looking forward to people hearing that and hearing your thoughts on that as well.
Fantastic. So that will be out hopefully in a week's time. Until then, keep following us on Twitter. Join us on Facebook. If you want to email us, you can do that again. We are at cinematologists@gmail.com. And that will just about do it for this week's episode of the Cinematologists podcast. So thanks once again for listening.
Tearing up holes in the house, they're tearing their paws in the ground. They're staring with blood in their mouth. Mama, they won't let me out. They tumble and fight, they are beautiful. On the hilltops at night.